Hello. I hope you guys enjoy this presentation. My name is Justin. This is my capstone project. I'm starting here with video one, which is the app diagram, the front end architecture, and the authentication that we included within our application. We chose the capstone one, which was the bad bank. So I thought it'd be good to start with the application overview diagram here, just to kind of level set and give you an idea for how the front end and the back end and the remote we used a PSQL instance all connect and talk to one another. We'll give a brief overview here, and then I will start showing you in more detail in the actual live application because I think that'll be helpful to get a better understanding for everything that we're going to talk about here, um, theoretically. So, the way that the front end works, for starters, is that on the Express server, we are using this static method which is part of the Express library. And what the static method does is it effectively creates endpoints for get method requests from the browser, which are responded to with the static files from some directory that we pass into the static method as a parameter. And the directory that we chose, or the name of the directory that we're going to use here for our static files is called the build directory. And we're actually only leveraging the get request with this with no extension on it, which is effectively just a get request to the base URL that we'll get into a little bit later because the rest of the mounting and rendering of the UI and the React components is going to be handled by React's hash router. So just to kind of dive a little bit deeper into what we just talked about, basically, when you go to the browser and you type in, let's say, um, myappcapstone.com. So myappcapstone.com is basically an API endpoint created by the dot static method. And with no extension, which is again this get method request with just slash on the base URL, which means no extension, the software in the dot static method that's built in behind the scenes, when it receives the get method request to this endpoint with no extension, which is effectively just the URL that you typed into the browser with no extension, the software in the dot static method is coded to go into the folder that is passed in to the method as a parameter and retrieve the eponymously named file um, after that endpoint. And or sorry, eponymously named file after the extension for the base URL. If there is no extension on the base URL, it retrieves index.html. So that's effectively what's happening here. So the browser, you type in mycapstoneapp.com, sends a get request to our Express server, which through the static method on the Express server created all these API endpoints, which are get methods, and each one of those responds with a file from the build directory, which is where all our static files are for the to our all front end static files are that get loaded onto the browser to create the UI. And if there is no extension on that get request, if there's no extension on the base URL in the get request, then then the endpoint that it goes to retrieves index.html. So index.html gets served into the browser. The way that we have this, set up from there is all of our JavaScript and CSS files are linked to the index.html file. And as mentioned here, the additional front end files in the architecture are rendered into a functional component called SPA, which in and of itself gets rendered into the div with the ID root in the index.html file by the code at the bottom of the file, with the SPA functional component to make this all work. And then React Hash Router handles serving, or I guess really rendering and mounting the rest of our UI functional components based on clicks and functionality built into the UI files, built into the files that are displayed on the browser. So just to quickly, I guess, show you what that looks like in terms of the architecture in our directory. We'll start here just to add a little bit more context to that. So here we have our express.static method. So this .static method is passed the name of a directory, which you can see here, a build directory. And this build directory includes just your static front-end files. You don't want to put anything that has potential sensitive information like server-side stuff in there, because these endpoints created by this static method are publicly accessible. So in theory, if anyone knows your base URL and your file names in here, they can go and fetch these files. So again, .static method, pass the parameter of build, creates effectively API endpoints for GET method requests eponymously named after every single one of these files. So you can type into your browser my capstoneapp.com/account access, and it'll serve the account access file. You can type in my capstoneapp.com/account balance, and it'll serve the account balance file. However, that's not how our architecture is set up. Our architecture is set up so that what you do is you type into the browser the base URL, and the base URL sends a GET request to an endpoint created here without, and if it's without an extension, it serves this index.html file, as we talked about. In the index.html file, all the JS and CSS files are linked up. There's the JS files. Sorry, my computer's going a little slow, and the CSS files are up here. You have your div with the ID root here, which is where everything's going to get pushed into via index.js, which holds your React hash router and gets pushed here, rendered, right, into the div with the ID root, which is located in index.html file. So that's how everything funnels up into this file, which is effectively the only file that's really served, I guess, explicitly to the browser through the GET method API endpoint created by our static method. So that's kind of the overview and the front end architecture. I guess as far as describing the component architecture of the front end, for this basic purposes of this application, we really just use static files which hold functional components. So like the account balance functional component, which actually gets mounted via the hash router, and then renders the HTML in their return section. We just created all these variables to style what we needed right in the file. So everything's kind of all together for the most part, which makes things a little bit easier. And then we just apply those like styles here, based on what we need by putting the embedded variables in here, embedding JavaScript in the return section. If we were to start scaling this application to include all of the things a bank UI needs, I would probably refactor the application to move the front end into a separate directory from the back end, rather than this kind of like all in one here where the Express server serves the front end files and build the front end with some kind of a webpack like Create React App or Next.js to compile and serve the front end files again separately, instead of relying on the Express server to do so. Some of the design decisions that I made, let's, I guess, just show the app. So I thought this was pretty neat. Basically, like, this is our, again, base URL, which fetches the index.html page, which then has the React router rendered into it, which, when there is no extension, renders your home component here. And that's what you see here. And then that home component, once it's mounted, renders the HTML in the return section, which is effectively this. So what I did was I kind of created a toggle here. So you go to account access, and buried behind this toggle is what I would say the account balance page. We effectively created authentication here so that you can't get to the account balance page until you pass the authentication, in this login component. Or similarly, again, this is the toggle. You can quickly toggle between create account page and login page, just like so. And once you pass, you only have to pass authentication on one of these two, i.e. if you're able to successfully create an account and authenticate that way, then the create account will get unmounted, and what will get mounted into its place is the account balance page. And similarly, if you can pass authentication on the login page, this login page will get unmounted, and the account balance page will get mounted in its place. So let me just give you a test one here to show you. So once you hit submit, then that login page gets unmounted, this modal gets mounted, and then once you hit view account balance, the modal gets unmounted, and this, I guess you could say, nested account page, it's not really nested though, it's just handled by the hash router function, will get rendered once you pass authentication. And then you can play around with the account balance. So let's log out. So to quickly highlight two methods of authentication that you developed, and why did I take this approach, we have authentication again here, and we have authentication here. I'll go through this one in the interest of time just quickly, but this component has two levels of authentication. So the first, the email address that you typed in must match an email address in one of the rows of the email column in the database. So that's one level of authentication that takes place on the server side. And if that doesn't happen, you'll get an error. If you pass that authentication, meaning this email exists in the database, then you go to your second level of authentication, which is authenticating the password. So once you pass this, the code will continue running on the server. If you don't pass this, it'll return an error. Let's just do this for example. You can probably see email says password may be incorrect or not exist, right? And then if you pass that authentication but with the wrong password, it'll say, oh, sorry, it's too short. Same thing, right? So this email exists, but the password is the second tier of authentication, where if the password in the database, if the password in the password column of the database does not match the email in the email column of the database for the row in which the password is located, then again you'll fail authentication. This is very similar, but there's only one level of authentication here. It's you authenticate by email, and if the email exists in the database, then you will say like you can't create an account. So, what challenges did I encounter when I was establishing authentication? So, initially, I was trying to code all this logic on the front end, which was requiring synchronous API requests based on the responses of the other, where each API would have its own database query. So, for example, I would send a query to I'd send a request to an email endpoint, which would have a query, and then that would respond if the email authenticated, and then I would spend another, that would receive a response on the front end, which would trigger another request to a password endpoint, which would receive a response from the database, and if that authenticated, then you would be able to log in. But that just didn't feel right. So what I did was I actually moved all of that logic, all of this logic that I was trying to code on the front end, um, which was requiring synchronous API requests based on the response of the other, to the back end. So all of that logic now lives on the server. And what that allowed me to do is just create one API endpoint called login, where you fill out these two parameters, and on submit, they get packaged up in a payload and sent to the login API endpoint. And within that endpoint, there are multiple database queries. And based on the result at the end of that string of queries on the server side, the server just sends back a very simple response, an intentional response to the front end, and then on the front end, all you have to do is build success and error handling built in based on the assortment of responses that were a possibility from the server. So what that means is you send everything to one API endpoint called login. Within login, there is a query that authenticates the email. And then if that passes, the server code proceeds to a query that authenticates the password. And if that passes, then we send back a success response, and we're allowed to continue to move on. Instead of having to send multiple API requests to two different endpoints to do our two different pieces of authentication. So I thought that was a much more fluent and intuitive way to do it. It also kind of separates concerns between what's going on the front end and the